Welcome to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights' fifth lecture in the Palestine Teach-In series. Today's teach-in, entitled The Question of Palestine and Zionism's Internal Debates After 1948, will be presented by Dr. Zachary Foster. The teach-in helps to complicate the evolution of Zionism, the relevant debates within Israeli society and the Jewish diaspora, and changing attitudes towards the political ideology of Zionism. While we do not expect nor even desire everyone to agree on the various topics presented in the Palestine Teach-In series or our lecture series, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is an equal participant in the open intellectual inquiry that makes Rutgers University a leading institution in public higher education. Rutgers University is also home to over 7,000 Muslim, Arab, and South Asian students across its 3 campuses and tens of thousands of alumni from these diverse communities. As such, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is proud to be the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school focused on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States as well as abroad. And we are housed at the Rutgers Law School, which is also known as the People's Electric Law School. The People's Electric Law School has a proud history of defending the rights of the underprivileged, the repressed, and the censored in American society. And at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, we do not participate in the Palestine exception, wherein Palestinians are dehumanized, denied equality, and shunned as terrorists as part of broader Islamophobic racist campaigns. Now, because of our inclusion of Palestinian perspectives, history, politics, and culture in our work, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights has been under immense attack by pro-Israeli and Zionist special interest groups, politicians, and parents who oppose free speech and academic freedom. Indeed, these same groups demanded that we cancel this very event in order to deny you the opportunity to choose for yourselves to watch and learn, agree, or disagree from Dr. Zachary Foster's presentation. So if you oppose such authoritarian campaigns that threaten fundamental American democratic values, including academic freedom and free speech, I encourage you to support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by making a donation, ideally a generous one, on our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and pressing the donate button. And you can also follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and RUCSRR. And you can learn more about our important work by subscribing to the Race and Rights podcast that I host, Sahar Aziz, Distinguished Professor at Rutgers Law School, and also subscribing to our YouTube channel. Now, it is ultimately up to each of you to use your critical thinking skills in determining your political position on these complex matters of public importance that we address at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. It is my distinct honor to now introduce you to Dr. Zachary Foster. Dr. Foster is a historian whose research explores the idea of Palestine as well as the origins of Palestinian identity in the 19th century. Dr. Foster holds a Master's of Arts in Arab Studies from Georgetown University and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. Dr. Foster is the founder of the of the digital archive Palestine Nexus, and writes a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox. Dr. Foster is a frequent contributor to international media outlets, including the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and he serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Welcome, Dr. Foster. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I will share my screen, and we've got a lot to get through, so let's get started. The State of Israel and the Palestinians, 1948 to 1967. Let's start with the topic of from Zionism to Israel, 1948 to 1967. So after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Zionists outside of Palestine were sidelined. So for example, Chaim Weizmann, who was the president of the World Zionist Organization before that, based in Britain, he was offered a mere ceremonial role as president of the State of Israel. The Zionist institutions in Palestine, by contrast, were transformed into the organs of the state of Israel. So, for example, the president of the Jewish agency executive became prime minister. That was obviously David Ben-Gurion. The Jewish National Fund was incorporated into the state apparatus as well. Thus, all of the key leaders in the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, on the eve of the establishment of the state of Israel, they all became the leaders of the state of Israel. And of course, as well, the Haganah, the pre-state militia, the pre-state Jewish militia, became the Israeli military, and it consolidated other militias such as the Irgun and the Stern Gang, which included violent confrontations between those various militia groups. And if you'll recall, in the 1940s, these Jewish militias carried out numerous terrorist attacks against civilians, including killing some 91 people in the King David Hotel in 1946. And as you see pictured here, you have Jewish immigrants on their just upon their arrival in Israel in the port of Haifa, whereupon they would be settled into government temporary housing. I want to talk a bit about Israel's basic laws. These are Israel's equivalent of a constitution. And before getting to those basic laws, a brief word about whether or not they would include the Palestinians. And in December 1948, so this is a few months after the establishment of the state of Israel, the military commander Elimelech Avner said, quote, "It would be best to deny the Arabs the right to vote entirely." In 1948 and 1949, the Israeli government discussed offering the Druze of the Galilee citizenship and the right to vote. The Druze being this minority group in the state of Israel that is also present in Lebanon and Syria and other countries, but not the Christians and the Muslims the right to vote, because the Druze showed loyalty, but apparently the Muslims and Christians did not. Thus, there were discussions around denying them the right to vote entirely. Those discussions taking place in the Israeli cabinet. In 1949, David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister of Israel, actually sabotaged efforts to establish a constitution. And he also sabotaged efforts to debate whether or not a constitution should be adopted. And the reason was actually quite simple. The reason for Ben-Gurion was to obstruct legal inflexibility. That is to say, to ensure the state of Israel had the legal flexibility necessary for, quote, the mainstays of the state and its future, its security, Jewish immigration, and settlement. In other words, Ben-Gurion did not want to put forward any constitution or embrace any constitution that would make it difficult in the future for the state to redefine its borders or deny Palestinians the right to vote, etc. And thus, in June 1950, the Israeli parliament enacted 14 basic laws, the basic laws requiring an Israeli parliament supermajority to change in order to establish, quote, the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. In other words, if you had to really summarize the essence of these 14, quote unquote, basic laws that were established in June 1950, the core of those basic laws is this idea that Israel is both a Jewish and a democratic state. Israel also wins support from the United States and the Soviet Union almost immediately after it's established. Both of the superpowers voted in favor of the UN resolution for partition, that November 1947 resolution, in which the UN called for the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Both the US and the Soviet Union also followed up with political support, diplomatic recognition, as well as vital military aid was provided by the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, you had American Jews and other Jews abroad buying Israel bonds, providing almost half of the country's development budget. And one thing I don't have on this slide, but is worth mentioning, is that you had a lobby, a fairly strong pro-Israel lobby already in the United States on the eve of Israel's establishment in 1948. And in fact, Harry S. Truman, pictured here on the right, was lobbied in significant ways by former business partners of his, including an American Jew who lobbied him extensively in the years leading up to the establishment of the state of Israel. And that was, at least according to some historians, one of the key reasons why he ended up recognizing Israel just 11 minutes or so after it was established. I want to talk about the law of return and the nationality law. So the law of return, which is adopted by the Israeli Knesset in 1950, grants every Jew in the world the right to immigrate to Israel. And then the nationality law, passed 2 years later, grants them citizenship. Now, it's important to note here that some 80% of Palestinians living in Israel did not receive citizenship until July 1952, when that nationality law went into effect. However, According to Shira Robinson, one of the world's foremost experts on this period, Arabs actually did not, many Arabs, some 60,000 Palestinians, did not even get citizenship until the 1960s. But of course, these laws, the nationality law and the law of return, did not even define what a Jew was, who was a Jew. It's a very complex question. And so this question was eventually resolved by the Israeli judiciary, the Israeli Supreme Court, which defined a Jew in 1970 as anyone with a single Jewish grandparent, which of course stood in contradiction to what traditional Jewish legal authorities defined as a Jew, which was anyone born a Jew according to Jewish law. In other words, anyone who has a Jewish mother. In other words, not someone with just a single Jewish grandparent, or according to traditional Jewish law, you could also be considered a Jew if you underwent a Orthodox conversion. And of course, herein lies these debates around which conversions are considered legitimate, which are considered illegitimate. According to the Israeli Supreme Court, only Orthodox conversions are considered illegitimate. And thus, if you converted to Judaism according to, say, a conservative rabbi, a Reconstructionist rabbi, a Reform rabbi, that conversion would not be recognized by the state of Israel. I want to talk a bit about the internal debates within Zionism in those first 19 years or so after the state's establishment. So you had Mapai. This was Ben-Gurion's political party. It dominated Israeli politics for the first 2 decades of the establishment of the state of Israel. Call it a center-left party, or perhaps even a far-left party, although far-left in the Israeli context, of course, given that it was a Jewish-only party until the late 1960s. You had Mapam, another Zionist party, socialist and communist, pro-Soviet. Excuse me, Mapai was the more center-left party. Mapam was, let's say, even further to the left than Mapai. And Mapam usually joined those coalition governments in those first 2 decades after the establishment of the state. Again, also Jewish-dominated party. You had Cherut. This is Menachem Begin's party. This party is, say, the heir of the revisionist Zionist movement founded by Ze'ev Jabotinsky in the 1920s. It's more militant, and it led the opposition in Israeli politics. Of course, it is also a Jewish-only party. It gained recognition and grew in prominence, in part owing to its support for low-income families, low-income Jewish families in the state of Israel, in development towns and slum neighborhoods. It's important to emphasize here that all these parties, these are the 3 largest parties in Israel during the period under discussion, all 3 parties supported the confiscation of Palestinian property in the aftermath of the war. We'll discuss that in just a moment. They all supported the border wars that Israel fought to, quote unquote, eradicate Palestinian militant resistance. They all supported Israel's military rule over the Palestinians that we're also going to discuss. Although a few individuals within Mapam opposed military rule, but again, we're talking about overall general consensus about Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, both within the borders of the state of Israel, that is the military rule placed on them, but also, of course, the treatment of the Palestinians kicked out of Israel and their prevention, Israel's policy of preventing them from returning to their homes, despite having been violently ethnically cleansed from them. Let's talk a bit more about the Israeli right. So as we said, Menachem Begin, he established this political party known as Cherut in 1948. Menachem Begin, he led the Irgun militia from 1944 onwards. This was one of the militias that carried out multiple terrorist attacks against the British, as we said, in one case killing as many as 91 people in 1946. The Cherut platform called for the exercise of Jewish sovereignty on both sides of the Jordan River. And as you'll see here, pictured to the right, just above the arch, you'll see a rifle and this map showing both British Mandatory Palestine and Transjordan, indicating that this Cherut party supported effectively the annexation of another sovereign state well into the 1960s. The Cherut party received something like 11.5% of the vote in 1948. Only modest gains had been made by the 1960s. So there's still a relatively small political party well into the 1960s and do not play a major role in Israeli politics, not until the 1970s, which we'll obviously get to. So Jewish immigrants to Israel for the first few decades of the state's existence. In September, Jews from Poland begin to migrate to Israel en masse. The Jewish Agency believed that these immigrants coming from Europe deserved better absorption conditions than Jews from Muslim and Arab countries, owing to the racism that was rampant among Ashkenazi Jewish leaders of the state of Israel from the state's establishment in 1948 all the way to the present day, I would say. And these Jews from Muslim and Arab countries, they were who migrated to Israel in the aftermath of 1948. They were placed in transit camps. You can see one of them pictured over here to the right. And in the words of the Israeli parliamentarian Yaakov Meridor, these immigration camps resembled concentration camps. I'm using his words. And he says, quote, "Is it not beneath the state of Israel to hold new immigrants behind barbed wire fences?" The vast majority of these Mizrahi, these Eastern immigrants, were placed in these ma'abarot, or these absorption camps, that were fenced in, 10 cities that turned to mud when with heavy rain. The new immigrants also spent their time waiting in long lines for showers, for bathrooms, for food. They were completely stripped of their privacy, and camp police ensured that they did not leave the camps. And eventually, many of them were later placed in development towns in the periphery. And another very interesting fact about the establishment of the state of Israel. This is actually going even before the establishment of the state of Israel, from 1945 to 1948, and then Israel continued this policy in 48 and then beyond, well into the 1950s. But effectively, the state of Israel made it difficult for Jews to leave the state of Israel. You could call this a policy of using Jews as demographic hostages. So, for example, from 1945 to 1948, you had all of these Jews who had Jewish refugees who wound up in Palestine. They were refugees from Europe. They fled persecution. They were Holocaust survivors. And many of them wanted to return home. They wanted to reunite with family in Europe. They wanted to reclaim lost property in Europe. And the state of Israel, and before that, the Jewish Agency, collaborated with foreign consular offices to make it difficult for those Jews to leave the state of Israel. Why? Because the state of Israel wanted a Jewish majority. And so any Jew that wanted to leave Israel was a problem. That was a real threat to the state's ability to secure its Jewish demographic majority. So the state wasn't primarily interested in the prosperity of Jews around the world, or the safety and security of Jews around the world. No, the state was interested in ensuring it had a majority of Jews in the state. And to the extent that helping ensure Jewish prosperity and helping ensure Jews are living their best lives, great. Then that was the policy of the state of Israel. But to the extent that those Jews wanted to leave Israel, well, then Israel acted against the interests of the Jews within the state itself. And here you have Samuel Cohen, a French Jew, who moved to Israel to fight with the Israeli army in July 1948. After the war, he wanted to go back home to France, and Israel refused to let him leave. Quote, "I served in the IDF. I was wounded and released from the army due to an illness," he wrote. Quote, "Now I wish to return to France. Holding us here against our will is a betrayal of trust. I was promised that I would be able to return to France. It is shameful for the state of Israel to keep people here against their will." Israel also sought to attack Jewish critics abroad, such as William Zuckerman, who in 1948 founded a journal known as the Jewish Newsletter, and he was highly critical of Zionism. In one of his reports, Zuckerman reported about a Holocaust survivor who had recently moved to Israel in the former home of a Palestinian. And he reports, quote, "The mother was struck by the thought that her children were playing with the toys of Arab children who were now exiled and homeless. Is she not doing to the Arabs what the Nazis did to her?" End quote. And so the Israeli government, through its consular offices in places like New York, went on letter writing campaigns, sending these appeals to, for example, the New York Herald Post, to discourage the paper from running more of Zuckerman's work. And they succeeded in killing Zuckerman's column at the prestigious London-based Jewish Chronicle. And by 1953, most of his work no longer appeared in the Jewish press. I want to talk about Israel and the Palestinians, and specifically Israel's rule over the some 150,000 Palestinians that remained within the borders of the state of Israel after Israel had expelled by force some to 750,000 Palestinians. But as we said, some number were left within the borders of the state of Israel, and Israel imposed military rule on those Palestinians. What did military rule mean? Well, it meant that any Israeli police officer could place any Arab in a military detention camp for up to a year, and that 1 year prison sentence was renewable indefinitely. This is a policy that Israel embraces to this day. It's a policy that it calls administrative detention, not because Palestinians have committed any kind of administrative offense, not because Palestinians didn't get a permit or a license to dig a well, or they're driving without a driver's license. No. These aren't administrative violations. These are crimes that Palestinians may commit in the future. That is the official reason why they're arrested. They've committed a future crime, and thus they need to be arrested. And that arrest, as we said, is renewable indefinitely. And in the year 1956, for example, Israel carried out 315 of these such quote unquote administrative arrests. These individuals were put before military courts where and those courts rarely, if ever, interfered with Israel's security forces' decisions. Of course, these military courts also restricted freedom of movement. Israel placed checkpoints at the entrance points and exit points of virtually every Palestinian village left in the state of Israel after 1948, or at least those that weren't destroyed. And Palestinians required permits just to be able to leave their own villages. For example, if you're a Palestinian in al-Fahim and you want to work in Haifa, or you're a Palestinian in Nazareth and you want to work in wherever else in the Galilee, you're going to need to obtain a permit just to leave your own village. Just to see your brother who lives 5 kilometers away, you will need to obtain a permit. And in fact, Israel denied Palestinians permits to leave their villages. In 1949, for example, just 7% of the 1,300 Palestinians in Nazareth who were working in Haifa before the war had permits to return to their jobs after the war. So the vast majority of Palestinians could not get permits to leave their own towns and cities. And even by 1956, only 13% of the some 6,000 Palestinians left in al-Fahim had been granted permits to leave. In 1958, only 3.5% of the male working population of the Negev or the Naqab had permits to work outside their reservations. The Israeli military could shut down roads, they could confiscate houses, they could build or confiscate land for security reasons. They could proclaim an area closed for military purposes. They could force any person to remain in place for any period of time. They could force businesses to remain open, force businesses to shut down. They restricted Palestinian freedom of speech. There was a heavy press censor. Palestinians could not publish freely during this period. Israel sought to hide its treatment of the Palestinians as well. Israel, of course, did not want Israeli Jews to know what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, and thus Israeli Jews knew quite little about the military rule itself, or how it strangled Palestinian economic development, as we just indicated on the previous slide, or how it strangled Palestinian wages or Palestinian access to the labor market or higher education. The military rule was eventually lifted in 1966, and the reason why it was lifted, according to Israeli officials at the time, was that it became clear by that point that Palestinians who had been internally displaced in 1948 could no longer return to the villages from which they were expelled or from which they were displaced. In other words, 19 years later, it was just simply impossible for those Palestinians to go and reclaim their property that had been stolen from them. And thus, Israel decided Israel could lift the military rule that it imposed on the Palestinians. The other thing I think people often forget about 1948 and about the expulsion of the Palestinian people is that it wasn't a one and done affair in 1948, but rather it was an ongoing process. And this is why many people talk about the Nakba not as a historical event, but as an ongoing process. There were expulsions in places in the north of Palestine, in Ghabsiya, Zaytun, Kufr Biraim, Ikrit, and other places. In those instances, in those northern towns that bordered Lebanon, the Palestinian people living in those towns and villages were told they would be allowed to return in 15 days. Wait for it. They were not allowed to return. And in fact, one Palestinian lawyer, Raja Shahada, took the case to the Supreme Court, and he actually won the case. But of course, the army, after the decision was handed down to the Israeli military, instead of allowing the Palestinians to return to those villages from which they were expelled, the army decided to destroy those villages instead, making return impossible. Of course, long after 48, Israel continued to expel Palestinians. In August 1949, Israeli forces violently raided the homes of Palestinians in Haifa, trying to increase pressure, instill quietism in them, and also encourage flight. In 1950, I don't have this listed here, but in 1950, the Israeli army also expelled some 2,700 inhabitants of Majdal. The city was then, after it was completely emptied of Palestinians, the city was renamed Ashkelon and became a Jewish city. Israel also, from 1948 to 1953, expelled something like 11,000 Palestinian Bedouin from the south. They did this all the way until 1959. This is, as far as I can tell, the last case of an forced expulsion during the period that we're discussing now. Some 400 Palestinians were expelled from the Naqab in 1959, as late as 1959. And in fact, of the Bedouin in the south of the country, so they were pushed. So the ones that weren't expelled from the south of the country, they were pushed onto an area that was just 10% of their ancestral homeland. In the north of the Naqab, basically a reservation was created for the Palestinian Bedouins. They were all forced onto a very, very small area of the Negev. The remainder of the southern desert, 90% of it was taken for Jewish development. Israel also sought to prevent the Palestinian refugees who were expelled from outside the country. Israel sought to prevent them from returning to their homes. And from 1949 until 1956, you had many, many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who braved the journey, crossing the armistice lines, trying to return to their homes that they were violently ethnically cleansed from in 48, trying to reclaim property, visit family. And what did the Israeli army do to those Palestinians? They adopted a policy of shoot to kill. And between 1949 and 1956, the Israeli military killed somewhere between 2,700 and 5,000 unarmed Palestinians. Those figures are from official Israeli sources, by the way. Those are Israeli foreign officers estimating the number of Palestinians that were slaughtered by the Israeli army in the 7 years after the establishment of the State of Israel. Israel also placed landmines around Gaza, preventing those Gazan Palestinians from seeking to return to their homes. Quote, hospitals in Gaza daily receive those who explored these roads and fields. That's a report from April 1949. Israel also committed disproportionate violence against those Palestinian refugees that did pick up arms. And in one case, in 1953, Ariel Sharon, who was then a commander, I believe he commanded the Southern Front in Israel. So he was basically the Israeli general in charge of Gaza at the time. He enters the West Bank in Gibeah, a Palestinian town, actually the West Bank, not Gaza, excuse me. And he massacred some 69 unarmed Palestinians. The Israeli military censor prevented the public from learning about what happened. During this same period, the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, tells Ariel Sharon in 1953, quote, unless we show the Arabs that there is a high price to pay for murdering Jews, we won't survive. There was an explicit order given by the Prime Minister of the State of Israel to Ariel Sharon, make them pay a high price. Israel also sought to ensure the Palestinian refugees would not be able to return home, and thus they destroyed some 500 Palestinian villages during and after the 1948 war. They confiscated some 4 to 7 million dunams of Palestinian property. They confiscated some 70,000 books, many thousands of vehicles, bank accounts, etc. Israel also confiscated about 1 million dunams of land from the internally displaced Palestinians, those who remained within the borders of the State of Israel. They also had some 40 to 60% of their property confiscated. Israel also established Jewish settlements on the land of the destroyed Palestinian villages. Some 109 Jewish settlements were built on the land of the depopulated Palestinian villages. And in other cases, Israel sought to hide the Palestinian villages that were destroyed by planting forests on their ruins. Israel did that again in 1967 and actually still does that to this day. Israel's occupation of Gaza, 56 to 57. So the context here is that Britain and France in 1956 want to reoccupy the Suez Canal because you have the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. He is nationalizing the canal, and this is threatening British colonial and French colonial interests in the Middle East. They align with their ally Israel to embark upon a neo-colonial war in which Britain and France want to reoccupy the Suez Canal to guarantee their commercial interests in the Middle East, whereas Israel wants to occupy Gaza. That is Israel's goal. They wanted to occupy it in 1948. The American diplomat, the most senior American diplomat at the time, prevented that from happening, but they had long wanted to occupy Gaza. Why? Well, because they wanted to expunge the Palestinian refugee population of Gaza. They wanted to eradicate the Palestinian militant resistance as well. And so they, in October 1956, they reoccupied the Gaza Strip. On November 3rd, 1956, Israeli forces enter Khan Yunis. They round up all the men above the age of 15, line them up in the city center of Khan Yunis and execute them. It was a massacre. They did the same thing in Rafah a few weeks later, executing another 100 Palestinians or so. In Khan Yunis, they executed between 150 and 200 Palestinians. The Israeli military, during its period of occupation from October 56 to March 57, they killed about 1,000 Palestinians in Gaza. The goal of those massacres was to encourage flight. The point was to try to incentivize Palestinians to leave. And of course, they failed utterly. About 1,000 Palestinians left the Gaza Strip actually during this period. So they managed to scare some Palestinians into leaving. But 56 was not 48. Palestinians were not leaving en masse like they did in 48. And so the project failed. But Ben-Gurion, prime minister at the time, nevertheless set up a committee to review proposals for the depopulation of the Gaza Strip. Israel was totally obsessed with pushing out the Palestinian refugees from Gaza, because here you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were stripped of their property, stripped of their means of livelihood, stripped of their citizenship status as imperial citizens of the British Mandate for Palestine. So now that you're talking about a refugee population, totally impoverished, living in conditions, totally horrific conditions, with no political rights. So of course they want to return home. And if they want to return home, that means they're a threat to Israel's demographic of a Jewish majority. And so what do you need to do with that? Well, you need to get them away. You need to send them off to some faraway land. And that was the plan. That's what Ben-Gurion tried to do in 56. And another thing to discuss here, and this is very much connected to the 56 invasion of the Gaza Strip. This is in October 1956. This is actually just one day before the war. So the whole point of this Kfar Qasim massacre that I'm about to talk about was to scare Palestinians within the borders of the state of Israel into quietism and silence, because Israel understood that if it goes on this campaign to go expel Palestinians from Gaza and commit all these massacres, it may encounter resistance within its own borders, among its own Palestinian population. And so what does it do? In October 1956, Israeli border police units were given orders by Shmuel Malinki, who was the battalion commander at the time. He says to his soldiers, quote, "It is desirable that there be a number of casualties," end quote. When Meir Amit, the army operations chief, was told of the massacre, he said, quote, "What difference does it make?" And this is not disputed. Historians agree that this massacre was ordered. There were senior commanders that gave the order to kill Palestinians who were returning to their homes after a curfew had been issued. Of course, the Palestinians were not made aware of the curfew, so they were returning to their homes, totally unaware that they were apparently not allowed to be out of their homes. And some 49 Palestinians were shot and killed. And in the aftermath of this massacre, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion expressed solidarity with the killers. They were, quote, compensated with their 2 or 3 years prison sentences with official appointments. In fact, the convicted murderer Gabriel Dahan, after 2 years in prison, he was placed in charge of Arab affairs in the city of Ramla and Lid. The first time Israeli soldiers were put on trial. This is actually the first time Israeli soldiers were put on trial for obeying an order that was deemed illegal. But again, as we said, these sentences that were given were very light, and then those that carried out the massacres were released within a few years, and they were given important positions. They were given important positions for example, in charge of Arab affairs, which is totally insane. But here we are. Let's talk a bit about the 1967 war. And during this transformative war, Israel conquers Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt. Israel conquered the Golan Heights from Syria, and it conquered the West Bank from Jordan. Israel annexed the Golan in 1980. It annexed Jerusalem in June 1967, a few weeks after the end of the war, and it applied military rule over the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Most of the issues of the quote-unquote Israel-Palestine conflict can be traced to the 67 war. Settlements, borders, occupation, resources, Jerusalem, all of these issues took their current form after the war. When asked if Israel could absorb a large number of Arabs, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan said, quote, "Economically, we can, i.e. we can absorb them, but I think that is not in accord with our aims in the future. It would turn Israel either into a binational state or a poly-Arab Jewish state, and we want to have a Jewish state. So we can't annex all these Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank because we want to be a Jewish state, and that would increase the proportion of people in our state that are non-Jewish. And the other important point I want to make here about the 67 war is that it was a war of choice. And again, this point is not debated among historians, although it is debated among pundits. But historians agree that everyone in the Israeli cabinet understood this was a war of choice. And they all came out in the early 1970s and said so. General Ezer Weitzman, who was the military operations chief at the time, said, quote, there never was a danger of extermination. It had never been considered in any serious meeting. In 1971, Mordechai Bentov said, quote, this whole story about the threat of extermination was totally contrived and then elaborated upon after the fact to justify the annexation of new Arab territories. So what the point I'm making here is that in the lead up to the war, and then of course during the war and after the war, Israel presented itself as this beleaguered country that was under threat of annihilation, when in fact, when you actually go back to the meeting notes and you ask the generals that were in the meeting, you ask the chief of staff in the meeting, you ask the military operations chief, that these people sitting in the meetings deciding to go to war on June 5th, 1967, they all later said there was no threat of annihilation. We were by far the stronger power, and we invented a threat of annihilation in order to conquer Gaza, the West Bank, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Israel wanted to expand its borders and use the threat of annihilation to justify the aggression. In June 1967, immediately after Israel conquered Jerusalem on the West Bank, it razed the Maghrebi quarter of Jerusalem's old city, destroying 135 homes, leaving 650 Palestinians homeless. Israel also decided to annex the Gaza Strip on June 19th, 1967, once the number of Palestinian refugees there could be significantly reduced by transfer to other locations. The most popular idea during those first few years after 1967 was to send Gaza's refugees, ideally to Jordan. If we can't send them to Jordan, we want to send them to the West Bank. And then potentially the West Bank could be partially returned to Jordan if it remained demilitarized. This was the view held by Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, and many others. I want to talk a bit about the quote-unquote Israeli left after 1967. This presentation is all about trying to understand the internal debates within Israeli politics. So the Israeli left, so we're talking, there's a typo, it should say Mapam. Mapam, this is, again, one of the leftist party in Israel. They were pro-annexation of East Jerusalem. Mapam members even settled in some of these militarized kibbutzim, these militarized agricultural colonies in the occupied territories, that is to say, in the West Bank and Gaza, including on land confiscated from Palestinians in Latrun, where Palestinian villages were razed to the ground to make room for the new Jewish settlements. Mapam leader Yaakov Hazan even said, quote, everyone who demonstrated against the settlement of Jews in Hebron, for example, is a traitor to the nation. So these are Israel's far left party coming out and saying, if you don't support the Jewish colonization of Hebron, the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank at the time, you're a traitor. However, there were some members of the Israeli left, like Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who understood the dangers of military occupation. And after the 1967 war, he predicted correctly that this war would turn Israel into, quote, into an instrument for the violent domination of another people. Israel would now become the persecutor rather than the persecuted. So there were some members in the Israeli left that understood, even Ben-Gurion himself understood that occupation was a problem because it would eventually lead Israel to become an apartheid state. He even says that shortly after the 1967 war. But of course, his warnings went unheeded. Israel's from the river to the sea policy. After the 1967 war, Israel drops the green line, that is to say, the line that divided Israel and the West Bank, as well as Israel and the Gaza Strip. Israel drops that line from government publications. It deletes the line from public school textbooks and maps. Israel wants to present historic Palestine as Israel, right? That the whole thing is Israel. Israeli textbooks portray the war as an act of liberation, returning to Judea and Samaria, where our patriarchs and matriarchs once lived, where the kingdom of David and Solomon was established, the heart of the people. Likud's platform, Likud is you could say, the intellectual heir of the Cherut party that we talked about a few slides ago. Quote, the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is eternal, and indisputable and is linked with the right to security and peace. Therefore, Judea and Samaria will not be handed to any foreign administration. Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. That is the official Likud platform that I believe dates to the 1970s and has not been amended since. So when you hear the phrase from the river to the sea, what you're actually hearing is a policy that was adopted by Israel's right wing to talk about Jewish control, Jewish domination, Israeli sovereignty from the river to the sea. A policy that most Israeli Jews supported. Israeli Jews believed at the time that this was a miraculous military achievement. It would provide Israel security. It was a fulfillment of messianic prophecies. And thus, by the end of 1967, the vast majority of Israelis supported keeping all of the occupied territory. And in general, it's fair to say the Israeli public rejected the idea of peace treaties with the Arab neighbors if it meant returning land, returning the West Bank, or returning the Gaza Strip, or even Sinai or the Golan Heights. The idea was land would provide Israel more security. Let's talk more about Israel's policy of depopulation. During the 1967 war, Israel made something like 250,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and some 45,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. They made them refugees. They organized bus transports, we're going to get to this in the next slide, to the border with Jordan. They also displaced something like 13,000 Palestinians who at the time of the war were outside of Palestine. Perhaps they were working abroad, they were studying abroad, they were traveling abroad. But because they were not present in the occupied territories at the time that Israel conducted its census shortly after the war, they were not given Palestinian ID cards. Thus, they were stripped of their right to be occupied peoples in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel was particularly focused on ethnically cleansing the Jordan Valley. We're going to get to the reasons why in a subsequent slide, where it expelled something like 88% of the Palestinians. We're talking about entire refugee camps of tens of thousands of people were expelled in Aqabat, Jabr, and Ain Sultan. Israel also dropped bombs, used aerial bombardment in as well as napalm, which is a very dangerous substance. It's in its destruction of West, Yalu, Beit Nuba, a dozen some Palestinian towns. It also destroyed significant parts of Qalqilia, not a town, I would say more like a city in the West Bank. Israel organized buses for some 200,000 Palestinians departing from Jerusalem and various towns in the West Bank to Jordan. How generous was it of the state of Israel to provide that free transport? And then when the Palestinians reached the border with Jordan, Israel effectively forced those Palestinians to sign a document declaring they were leaving the country voluntarily. Nothing screams like voluntary relocation, quite like requiring someone to sign a document saying it's voluntary. This is how one Israeli soldier described the situation, quote, "Although there were those deportees who were leaving voluntarily, so there were some, but there were also not a few people who were simply expelled. We forced them to sign. A bus was arriving and only men were getting off. They did not want to leave, but were dragged from the buses while being kicked and hit by revolver butts. By the time they arrived, they were usually already completely blurred at this stage, did not care much about the signing. It seemed to them like part of the process. In many cases, the violence used against them was producing desirable results from our point of view." And then in the years after 1967, Israel embarked on a policy to depopulate the Gaza Strip. They established what they called resettlement agencies, compelling some 32,000 Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip in 1968. In some cases, they offered promises for visas, or they offered promises for offering Palestinians property abroad in places like Paraguay or Brazil or Libya. And in some cases, those Israeli agencies, they would promise farmland or jobs or help obtaining passports. And this whole scheme was abandoned in 1970 after Israel promised the Palestinian work in Paraguay. That promise went unfulfilled. That Palestinian went and assassinated the secretary of the Israeli ambassador in Paraguay, and the policy collapsed. And in 1971, Golda Meir essentially realized this policy was failing, and she says, anyone who believes that we can incentivize hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to abandon Palestine is delusional. Those are her words, I believe, in 1970. And then in 1971, Israel shifts its policy from carrots to sticks. And instead of trying to incentivize Palestinians to leave, quote unquote, voluntarily, it decides instead to embrace force. And in 1971, Israel enters the Palestinian refugee camps in the Gaza Strip, in Jabalia, and Shati, and elsewhere. and destroys some thousands of Palestinian refugee homes, expels some. Actually, this figure is wrong. It should actually say 38,000 Palestinians were expelled in 1971 alone. Many were expelled to North Sinai. Many more were expelled to the West Bank or to Jordan. And then in 1982, Israel did something similar, destroying many thousands of Palestinian homes, primarily along the Rafah border with Egypt. Israel also embarked upon a Judaization program. Wherever there were large concentrations of Palestinians in the Jewish state, Israel sought to thin out those populations. Here you have Yosef Nachmani and Yosef White said a Jewish majority in the Galilee was needed to, quote, minimize the Arab threat and prevent the formation of a, quote, nucleus of Arab nationalism within the Jewish state. As you can see here pictured to the right, we have a map of the Galilee of northern Israel, in which you have some of these districts, you have very, very large concentrations of Palestinians. And for Israel, anytime you have large numbers of Palestinians living together, that's a threat. It's a threat because any kind of nucleus of Arab, a concentration of Arab populations, well, my gosh, maybe they might plot to do something bad. So the mere existence or presence of large concentrations of Arabs is a problem. And thus, in the 1950s and 1960s, Israel confiscated land from Palestinians in the Galilee, some 74,000 dunams of land confiscated in 55. Israel also took over an area near Baqa al-Gharbiyah. This is also in the north in 59 as in order to establish an area to train soldiers for military maneuvers. Israel's courts rarely challenge land theft when the reason provided by the government is security. Israel, as we said earlier, was obsessed with the Jordan Valley. As we said on June 19th, Israel made the decision to annex the Jordan Valley, that the Jordan River would be Israel's border, and that is why Israel that is why already in the early period, in the late 60s and 70s, Israel began annexing large swaths of land in the Jordan Valley. It was perfect for annexation because it was a massive territory of land. You're talking about a third of the West Bank is just the Jordan Valley. So you're talking about a large area of land, but here's the kicker, without very many Palestinians living on it. Only some, a few tens of thousands were living on it at the time. And so the whole, if you really want to try to summarize the essence of Zionism in a single sentence, is we want to take over the land of Palestine, but we just don't want the people living on that land with it. So the Jordan Valley was sort of a kind of a Zionist dream come true, a large area just without very many Palestinians living on it. And this is why in the Yigal Alon plan, as it was known, that was the policy of the Israeli government towards the occupied territories for the first 2.5 decades after 67. The plan explicitly called for Israeli control in the Jordan Valley, that area to the east of the large population centers to the west of the Jordan Valley. It's, quote, almost completely devoid of population, and thus it became a target for Israel's annexation efforts, a target that obviously carries through all the way to the present day. Let's talk about the period from 1967 to 1993. Likud won in 1977. So this is the Israeli right coming to power after 30 years of control and of rule by the Israeli left. You could say that many Israelis appear to have voted against Labor rather than for Likud, and there were a lot of reasons for that. There were scandals and there was a lot of corruption, and people were unhappy with Labor's economic policies. There was high inflation in Israel during the 1970s, etc. Likud did well among young people. They also did well among Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, those Jews living in the peripheral towns. And by 1977, Likud presented itself as the party of the disadvantaged, whereas Labor was seen as the party of the elite, of the establishment. And Likud's hawkish posture towards the Arabs, as well as his insistence that Israel retain control of the West Bank and Gaza, was also quite popular. These are the major political parties in Israel. From 67 to 93, you had Labor, which included Mapai during periods, certain periods. You had Likud, which represented the right. You had Shas, which was the religious party, primarily consisting of Mizrahi Jews from Eastern and Muslim countries. You had Meretz, which was the left-wing party in Israel, established in 92. And then you had the Arab parties that sought equal rights for Palestinians in Israel. Of course, Israel's Judaization programs continued well into the 70s. Of course, they continue to this day. We'll get to that eventually. But in 1976, Israel announced plans to confiscate another 20,000 dunams of Arab-owned land between Sachnin and Araba in the Galilee. What happened? The Palestinians protested, and Israel, in response to those unarmed protesters, slaughtered some 6 unarmed protesters, injuring 100 in what became known as Land Day. And it's celebrated to this day. I believe it's in March. And in 1977, Israel's Minister of Agriculture, Ariel Sharon, ordered the construction of 30 Jewish settlements in the north. The idea here being we want to place Jewish settlements basically in between Arab population centers. The idea being that will prevent the growth of those Arab towns, the natural growth of those Palestinian population centers, by putting Jewish settlements within them and in their midst. This policy of Ariel Sharon's continued in 1991, when he introduced what was at the time known as the Seven Stars Initiative, this time placing Jewish settlements not in between Palestinian population centers within Israel, but by placing Jewish population centers between Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank. I want to talk a bit about Israel's views on settlement expansion, because I think it's oftentimes perceived that the left, the Israeli left, is opposed to occupation, right? That, Zionism for the Israeli left ended in 48, and thus the Israeli left was apparently happy with Israel's 48 to 67 borders and opposed occupation. This is a myth, obviously. Every Israeli leader, including all leftist Israeli leaders like Yitzhak Rabin, like Golda Meir, who were both members of the Israeli left, they were both pro-settlement. In Golda Meir's case, there was a meeting of the Israeli cabinet in 1971 in which she says, "There's something I'd like to ask. It was our habit for anything that has to do with settlements, outposts, land expropriations, we simply do not talk about it." She's responding to all of these Israeli ministers who were going on roadshows and doing media tours in the Israeli settlements that were established in the occupied Palestinian territories in 1967, 8, and 9, in the years leading up to this statement in 1971. But she supported it. Quietly, of course, right? But she supported Israeli settlement expansion. So did Yitzhak Rabin in 1976 when he was prime minister. He supported a more limited approach to settlement. He actually only supported settlement in quote-unquote security areas, basically wherever there were either sparsely populated areas, so that would be the Jordan Valley, or wherever there were quote-unquote strategic areas like Jerusalem, where Israel just wanted to control the whole thing. Of course, settlements could be established there, although settlements, he opposed settlement construction in densely populated Palestinian areas like Hebron. So the debate within Israel was not should there be settlements or should there not be settlements? It was just where should the settlements be placed, and how many Israeli Jews to encourage to live in those settlements. But it was not should there be settlements or should there not be. There was consensus that there should be, even again on the Israeli left, and of course on the Israeli right, there was even more support for Israeli settlement expansion. As you can see here, the settlement expansion picked up dramatically in the 1980s when the Israeli right came to power. Between 1982 and 1988, you had a tripling of the settler population. This is at a time, again, like I said, when Likud is dominating Israeli politics. It should go without saying that transferring parts of one's own civilian population into occupied territory is a violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and thus it's illegal under international law. There's no debate about that. Thus, all Israeli settlements are illegal under international law. Settlers who live in occupied territory have full rights in Israel. They, of course, live side by side Palestinians who have no rights in Israel, thus making the settlement enterprise damning evidence of Israel's apartheid regime. And that's why every single human rights organization in the world, or at least every relevant human rights organization in the world, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, El-Damir, pretty much all of them agree Israel is practicing apartheid. The newly elected Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, she was elected Prime Minister, I believe, in 1970. She has this famous quote, of course, where she says, there was no such thing as a Palestinian. And this has been long part of Israel's practice and policy and worldview, which is that there were no Palestinians, they were Arabs, or maybe they were Southern Syrians, or they're Muslims and Christians, but they can't possibly be Palestinians. This idea that, same with the refugees, there were Arab refugees, never Palestinian refugees. Many Zionist publications describe Arabs as possessed by, quote, a fanatical hatred for all other groups, as anti-Semitic, as bloodthirsty, irrational leaders. Israeli textbooks consistently erase Palestinians from textbooks, presenting them as primitive or violent. Palestinians, of course, in Israel face discrimination. They're prohibited from owning somewhere between 80 and 93% of the land of Israel to this day. Where does that figure come from? So about 13% of the land of Israel is controlled by the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund's mission is to develop land for the benefit of Jews. And so Palestinians are effectively excluded from the development projects pursued by the JNF. And then about 80% of the land of Israel is controlled by Jewish regional councils. And Jewish regional councils, they have admissions committees. And those admissions committees, they're the ones who control who is allowed into these Jewish agricultural settlements, these rural Jewish towns. And they determine who's allowed to move to them. And they have a policy in which they can deny anyone the right to move to these communities because of their lack of suitability to, quote, social life in a small community or agricultural settlement. And that's why 99.6% of people living on that 80% of the land of the state of Israel that we just talked about are Jewish. Of course, Palestinians face discrimination in politics. Their local municipalities receive much less funding than Jewish ones. They are discriminated against also because they do not serve in the military or national service. And that is used as a means to discriminate. It's kind of a backdoor of discrimination. So if you don't want a Palestinian to fill a certain job that you're that you have, you would just say you need to have served in the military, and thus you've excluded the vast majority of Palestinians who do not serve in the military. Palestinians are also dramatically underrepresented in nearly all spheres of public life: the courts, parliament, media, civil service. As many as half of Israeli Jews consider Palestinians. This is according to many, many polls that have been conducted over the years, many of them by Israel's these are Zionist organizations conducting these polls, by the way. Something like as many as half of Israeli Jews consider Palestinians in Israel an inherent security threat. That is, they are a problem because they do not have J-positive blood. They have P-positive blood. Thus, they are inherent security threat. In fact, many even center-left columnists in Israel regard Palestinians as a time bomb, right? They're a problem because they have too many babies, and thus they're a fifth column, and thus are a problem owing to their DNA. Palestinians, dozens of Palestinian Bedouin communities, the Bedouins are really, almost always face the most discrimination of all the Palestinian communities, not just because they're Palestinian, but also because they're nomadic, and which makes them double targets for the state of Israel. They're not recognized. There's some 60 Palestinian Bedouin towns in the south that are unrecognized, meaning they're not provided electricity or water or health or bus service. These communities have the highest dropout rate and unemployment rate of any community in the country. Over the course of the past 56 years, Israel has also embarked on a campaign to Judaize Jerusalem, and they've done this through a variety of mechanisms. Beginning in 1967, what Israel did was it annexed some 70 square kilometers of the West Bank into the Jerusalem municipality. And what this did was it dramatically expanded the number of Palestinians in the city. And this was hugely problematic for Israel's leaders at the time, because Israel wanted not just a majority of the country's capital to be Jewish, but they wanted a supermajority of Jerusalem to be Jewish. And so when it annexed the city, when it annexed this territory, these 70 square kilometers of land, it of course did not annex the people living on it, who were not given Israeli citizenship. Instead, they were required to apply for Israeli citizenship, and some 60% of those who applied are denied. In the 1990s, Israel also began to require Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. They began to require them to prove East Jerusalem was, quote, Jerusalem is their, quote, center of life. And thus, over the course of the past 56 years, and especially over the course of the past 30 years, Israel has revoked the residency rights of some 15,000 Palestinians in what human rights calls acts of forcible transfer. This is stripping someone of their right to reside in their city of birth, to live in their city of birth, merely because they were perhaps moved abroad for some period of time or moved to some other town in Israel, the West Bank for some period of time, right? They would lose their right to live in Jerusalem and thus lose their residency status to live in anywhere in Israel proper or the West Bank. Thus, if they're lucky, they would have a Jordanian passport and be forced to move to Jordan. If they're unlucky, they may have no paperwork at all and thus be effectively totally stateless people. Israel also discriminated against Palestinians in education. For example, in 1991, Arab municipalities received 1/3 of the investment per pupil as Jewish municipalities. There was a shortage of some 5,000 classrooms in the Arab educational system in Jerusalem. Or excuse me, that's in all of Israel. Israel also discriminates. Palestinians are also face a huge amount of discrimination in the workforce. 45% of Palestinians and 58% of Palestinian children live below the poverty line. That percentage is much, much lower of the overall population within Israel. So, for example, Palestinians on average earn about $7,700 a year in comparison to the overall GDP per capita in Israel, which is 19,000. When it comes to health, Arab babies are about 2.5 times more likely to die during childbirth than Jewish babies. And then, of course, Palestinians face brutality by the police. As we already talked about, on Land Day, Israeli security forces killed 6 unarmed protesters. Again, in 1997, Israeli forces injured 55 Arab protesters who were protesting the confiscation of land. There's a long history of this. In 1990, in October 1990, Israeli security forces killed 20 unarmed Palestinian protesters in Jerusalem. We could go on and on. Let's talk about Gaza and the West Bank. So, as we said, Israel imposed military occupation on the Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel's military rule was belligerent. Israeli forces killed about 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years. For those 20 years, Israeli forces detained about 25,000 Palestinians every year for those 20 years. Israeli forces banned political expression. You could not organize 10 people for a political purpose. You could not wave a Palestinian flag. You could not call for Palestinian independence. You cannot use the name Palestine in the name of an association. You cannot wave a Palestinian flag. That's, of course, why the watermelon became a Palestinian symbol. And that's also why That's also why a Palestinian by the name of Fatih Rabban sat 6 months in an Israeli prison in 1982, because he painted a painting using the colors of black, red, green, and white. And Palestinians' education was censored. Israel decided what Palestinians would be able to teach in schools. The Palestinian newspapers were also heavily censored. Israel banned many, many books in the occupied territories. Israel also decided who Palestinians were allowed to marry. Israel rejected the overwhelming majority of family reunification requests during this period. And so if you're a Palestinian, say from the West Bank, and you want to marry a Palestinian from Israel, or if you're a Palestinian from Gaza, you want to marry someone from abroad, you would struggle to get your son or your father or your daughter or your spouse, you would struggle to get them a residency permit to live in Palestine. Again, for one reason and one reason only, because you're Palestinian. Jews had no such trouble. Jews would easily be able to bring their family members to the state of Israel or spouses into the state of Israel. Of course, Palestinians were denied that right. Israel also dominated the resources of the occupied Palestinian territories. Some 27% of the West Bank was closed as a military zone from 67 to 75. Another 22% or so of the West Bank was declared, quote unquote, state land. Most of that land became the site for Jewish settlements. Israel declared some 6% of the West Bank nature reserves, also making that land off limits to Palestinians. And of course, Israel controlled the water. That includes the groundwater, surface water, and the rainwater. So if you want to, for example, collect rainwater, well, you would need a permit from the Israeli military to do that, because the rainwater in Palestine is also under the control of the Israeli military. And of course, these Israeli settlers, they consumed dramatically more water than Palestinians. Some 6 to 9 times as much water was consumed by the Israeli settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories as compared to the Palestinians living there. Let's also talk about the post-1993 period, the period brought on by the Oslo process. And you could say that the lead up to Oslo was a new philosophy that was emerging within Israeli society at the time. You could say this philosophy was an outcome of the first uprising, the first Intifada, the time during which Palestinians rose up, overwhelmingly unarmed Palestinians rose up in rejection, protesting that belligerent military occupation that we just talked about. And this new philosophy that emerged in response to these protests was separation. Think Jim Crow, right? Think we need to extricate ourselves from the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and thus emerged the mentality of we need to build walls. And thus, in the early 1990s, Israel begins building a wall around Gaza. Yitzhak Rabin proposes a physical barrier to divide Israelis and Palestinians. In fact, he's remembered as the quote-unquote prime minister of peace. But in fact, in 1992, when he was campaigning for prime minister, he campaigned on the promise to, quote, keep Gaza out of Tel Aviv. At one point during the campaign, he even said, quote, I would like to see Gaza drown in the sea. In 1994, he also said that, quote, we have to decide on hafrada, that we have to decide on separation as a philosophy. We have to reach a separation between us and them. This policy thus lays the groundwork for Oslo, as well as the policy of closure, i.e. lockdown, that Israel adopted increasingly in the 1990s that we'll talk about in just a minute. Israel also adopts all of these, builds walls, which we'll obviously talk about as well, the Bantustanization of the West Bank, disengagement, all around basically separation. Close Palestinians in, build walls around their communities, lock them up, and throw away the key. In 2000, Haaretz journalist Gideon Levy says, public support, you have overwhelming public support for this new philosophy of separation. And so, as we already said, during that first uprising that led to this new policy, or that led to this new kind of philosophy that became very popular in Israel, about 160 Israelis were killed in political violence, mostly security forces, during that period, during that first uprising from 87 to 93. So Israelis realized occupation was costly. Occupation was deadly. When you impose violence on another people, well, guess what? There's going to be blowback. The violence will come back right at you. And Israelis realized that. And so they began to embrace this policy of separation. The PLO in 1998 had unilaterally accepted Israel's right to be a Jewish state. And the new Israeli labor government elected in 1992 had factored in the growth of Hamas when it decided to enter into negotiations. I should have actually prefaced this side by saying that what we're trying to do here is understand the buildup, the lead up to the Oslo process that really defined the next 30 years of the Israel-Palestine question. And so in the lead up to Oslo, you had the first Intifada, which played a key role. You had the PLO recognition of Israel as a Jewish state in 88, which played a key role. You had the Israeli government's recognition that, my gosh, there are these other militant groups that are rising up that pose a much, much greater threat, actually, than the PLO, which had renounced violence, which had recognized Israel, which was effectively becoming increasingly irrelevant. And that was the organization that Israel signed the Oslo Accords with in 1993. The Oslo process did not require Israel to end the occupation or settlement expansion. It did not require Israel to stop confiscating Palestinian land, to stop destroying Palestinian homes, or to stop imposing lockdowns and checkpoints. In fact, all of those things got much, much worse after the Oslo process. Israel did not recognize the Palestinian people's right to a state or their right to self-determination during the Oslo Accords. Instead, what Israel did was it recognized the PLO as the, quote, sole representative of the Palestinian people. And so that is what Israel primarily agreed to in the Oslo Accords. It also agreed to transfer over some amount of autonomy to the PLO, as well as its child organizations like the Palestinian Authority, an outgrowth of the PLO. And that organization, the PA, ended up taking over some amount of control in urban areas in the West Bank and Gaza, beginning with Jericho and Gaza. And then over the course of the 1990s, Israel signed all of these interim agreements, the 95 Oslo II agreements, and the 97 Hebron agreements, and the 98 Y memorandum. So throughout the 1990s, Israel is transferring over some amount of control to the Palestinian Authority in primarily, like I said, urban areas of the West Bank, the rural areas. So we're talking 82% of the West Bank, that was Israel retained complete control, complete security control over 82% of the West Bank, that is areas B and C. Whereas Area A, the Palestinian Authority, in theory, had security control, although, of course, over the course of the last 30 years, the Israeli army entered Area A. Israeli forces entered Area A whenever they wanted. And in fact, after the Oslo process, what Israel did was, because it can no longer operate openly, the Israeli military can no longer operate openly in the Area A, so in Palestinian urban centers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Instead, what it did was it dramatically expanded and increased the size of Unit Dubdevan, which is the Israeli unit in charge of covert operations. And you have Israeli sources over the course of the past 30 years talking about how we carry out security operations in Palestinian urban areas of the West Bank and Gaza on a daily basis, not a weekly or a monthly basis, on a daily basis. Israel, of course, continued to pursue security operations in all areas, areas A, areas B, and areas C of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip on a continual basis from 1993 all the way to the present day. So in some sense, actually, Israel's transfer of even security control to the Palestinian Authority, it was actually a facade. They continued carrying out security operations at a continuous basis over the past 30 years. Let's talk a bit more about the reception of the Oslo process within Israel. So the Israeli right, they organized demonstrations against the Oslo process. They considered it a betrayal. As we already said, the Likud's charter was Jewish control from the river to the sea. So obviously any attempt by the Israeli left to hand over any control of any land at all to the Palestinians was a betrayal of national security. The right-wing leader, a right-wing extremist inspired by Meir Kahane, who founded a political party in Israel, a very racist political party in Israel in the 1980s known as Kach. So this movement, these right-wing Kahanis, as they're known today, he assassinates Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, thus weakening support for the Oslo process. By 1999, Ehud Barak had told Yasser Arafat, his main interlocutor, that he was going to bundle the October 1998 Y memorandum together with the final status talks. So just to double click on this for a minute, as we were saying, Israel is transferring over. Okay, we'll give you a little bit more control. You can control this area here. You can control that area there, as we're saying throughout the 1990s. But the last, one of the final transfers of control to the Palestinian Authority was supposed to take place in October 1998, but then Prime Minister Ehud Barak told Yasser Arafat, he said, well, we're not going to transfer that authority over to you. Instead, we'll just wait and bundle it together with the final status talks when we resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, which of course never ended up happening, and thus that land actually never even got transferred over to the Palestinians. And this is one of the reasons why the Camp David negotiations failed in 2000, because there was a great deal of mistrust on both sides. And so you could say that the Oslo process failed because Israel was both party to the Oslo Accords, it was the interpreter of the Oslo Accords, but it was also the enforcer of the Oslo Accords. And so the Accords stated that Israel got to control, for example, it got to retain control of military zones in the West Bank. And this is just to cite one example of the kinds of mistrust that were taking place during this process. Netanyahu stated in a leaked recording in 2001, in this recording, he's referring to his, when he was prime minister in 1997, he says in this leaked recording, quote, no one said what defined a military zone. Defined military zones are security zones. And as far as I'm concerned, the entire Jordan Valley is defined as a military zone. And so here we see the problem with Israel being the party to the Accords and the interpreter of the Accords and the enforcer of the Accords. It gets to define what a military zone is. Well, the whole Jordan Valley is a military zone. And ultimately, this is one of the reasons why the process broke down. Thus the process failed in 2000 during the Camp David Accords, where no agreement was reached. No agreement was reached in 2001 in Taba, and no agreement was reached in 2007-8 during Annapolis. The parties were simply too far apart. There was too much distance between the positions of the Israelis and the position of the Palestinians. I think Noam Chomsky said it best when he said that if you examine the sides of the two positions according to international law, Israel did not make a single concession, because all the concessions that Israel made, all the quote-unquote concessions that Israel made during all of these negotiations in Camp David in 2000, and Taba in 2001, and Annapolis in 2007, because according to international law, Israel has to withdraw from the entirety of the occupied territories. all the occupation is illegal, right? Jerusalem, Israel's withdrawal from East Jerusalem, right? All the refugees need to be allowed back. That's international law, right? So all the major issues were, if you just look at international law, Israel had to basically concede on. And so according to what Israel wanted, it made concessions. But according to what international law stipulated, Israel did not offer to make even a single concession throughout this entire process. That's what Noam Chomsky argued already in the early 2000s. The process breaks down as well because you have Israel choosing its own security ahead of Palestinian freedom throughout the 1990s. And so, for example, from 1993 to 2000, Israel is killing 3 Palestinians for every 1 Israeli killed. Israel is also imposing lockdowns. That is to say, Israel is setting up checkpoints at the entry and exit points of every Palestinian town and village and refugee camp in Gaza and the West Bank for 64 days in 94, for 84 days in 1995, for 90 days in 1996. During periods of peak lockdown, unemployment reached 70% in the Gaza Strip. 10,000 families needed emergency food aid during this period. Israel exacerbated the atmosphere of distrust through its land confiscations, through its settlement expansion, and through the expansion of its occupation infrastructure. And you see here pictured to the right, while Israel's supposedly supposed to be building trust with the Palestinians, supposedly is supposed to be handing over authority to the Palestinians. Meanwhile, it's confiscating more land from the Palestinians and expanding settlement construction, such as here, pictured here in Ma'ale Adumim in 1996. This brings us to Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005. And oftentimes you'll hear Israeli enthusiasts talk about, we gave Gaza back to the Palestinians, right? That's the story you will hear. But if you go back to Israeli statements at the time that Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, that was actually the reason why they withdrew, was to develop a PR strategy. The idea was that we can, and now I'm using the words of Israeli spokespersons at the time, we're making painful sacrifices for peace. Right? In fact, the opposite was true. The reason, according to Dov Weissglass, the advisor to then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, why Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip was to, quote unquote, freeze the peace process, was because if you have a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that is separated from a Palestinian Authority in Gaza, you have effectively 2 different entities separated by geography, disconnected from one another. And ultimately, this is going to make it much, much harder for the Palestinians to develop a united front. And this was explicitly stated at the time. And in fact, what Israel did was not withdraw from the Gaza Strip. It repositioned its forces from within to without. I think the correct analogy here would be if you are in control of a prison, instead of stationing and the prisoners are violent and they're rowdy and they're killing prison guards all the time, right? So instead of putting your prison guards inside the prison where they face attacks, you just appoint a few prisoners to manage who gets to go out into the courtyard, which prisoners are in solitary confinement, and you just withdraw to the perimeter and control Gaza from the outside, which is what Israel did. It still controlled the population registry of Gaza. It still controlled the airspace. It still controlled the coastal water, 6 out of the 7 land borders. Gaza remained dependent on Israel for its food, water, electricity, internet, and telecommunications. In other words, Gaza was still occupied. And that's why every major human rights lawyer and international legal expert says Gaza was still occupied. And by the way, the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, just determined in July 2024, they determined that the occupation is illegal, just as dozens of human rights experts had before that. Israel, of course, continued its settlement expansion. As you can see the chart here, it's just up and to the right. The settlements expansion just goes one way, and it's actually surprisingly linear, right? Just every year, just natural growth, natural expansion, more settlements. And the Israeli government encouraged this. They subsidized mortgages in the occupied territories. The land there was much cheaper because it was stolen from Palestinians, right? The teachers' salaries were higher in the settlements because Israel was encouraging Israelis to move there. You actually paid lower taxes there as well. And Israeli businesses were also encouraged to set up shop in the West Bank. They would be given indemnification. They would be given subsidies by the government. They would be given access to water for industrial use, to build dairy farms and vineyards. Meanwhile, Palestinians were denied such access. As we said, if you're a Palestinian in the occupied territories, you need to apply for permits to dig wells. You need to apply for permits to collect rainwater. Whereas if you're an Israeli who has moved there illegally, you are given those things. And of course, settlers consume dramatically more water than Palestinians do. In fact, the Israeli settlements automatically get connected to the Israeli national water supply. Whereas, as we said, in fact, Palestinians are constantly seeing their wells destroyed. Between 2010 and 2016, Israel permitted Palestinians to build 2 new water wells while demolishing 11. I also want to talk a bit about Israel's Judaization within Israel proper. So we're not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. We're talking about within Israel, within the 48 to 67 borders of the state of Israel. In Jaffa, for example, since 2008, you've seen an influx of Jewish Israelis, of Zionists, building religious seminaries and pre-military academies exclusively for religious Zionists. They have marched through the streets of Jaffa, chanting Jaffa for the Jews. Jaffa, of course, is a historically Palestinian city. One Israeli scholar even dubbed this, quote, the Hebronization of Jaffa, in reference to the city of Hebron in the West Bank, which is a divided city between H1 and H2. H1, we don't have time to really get into the details of that, but basically they're saying that that Israeli Jews are trying to do the same thing in Jaffa as they have done in Hebron. Jews thus then claim, so Jews, they'll build these religious seminaries, they'll be chanting, Jaffa for Jews, and then they'll face counter protests, and then they'll demand we need extra police protection, thus exacerbating tension, exacerbating the counter protests, leading to more police brutality and more police violence, thus leading to more protests, and the cycle continues. In the south as well, in 2012, there were proposals submitted in the south of Israel. We're talking about the Negev, the Naqab. There were proposals submitted to the Prime Minister's office to push for the establishment of new Jewish villages in a 180 square meter area of the land straddling the Green Line between Arad and Meitar. The goal here is similar to the goal of Jewish settlement expansion elsewhere, which is to, quote, prevent the Bedouins from taking over the area. Religious Zionists established a community in Akka known as Garin Torani, Torah Nucleus, about 25 years ago. Similar goal to Judaize the city of Akka. There's a similar effort happening in Lod. Wherever you have large concentrations of Palestinians inside the state of Israel, so again, Jaffa, Lod, Akka, the Negev, you have communities of Jews moving into those towns, trying to Judaize those cities. So if it wasn't enough that Israel's trying to Judaize the West Bank and Gaza, well, they're doing the same thing within Israel proper as well. I'm focused a lot on this theme of depopulation because I really think it's really the critical theme in Zionist and Israeli history as it relates to the Palestinians. Because again, if you ask yourself, what is Zionism? Zionism is a movement of Jews to establish a Jewish majority, a Jewish state in a country of overwhelmingly non-Jews. And thus the way you do that is through depopulation. And that's why over the course of the past 76 years, you constantly get efforts to Judaize, depopulate, Palestinian refugees from Gaza, Palestinians in the Jordan Valley, Palestinians in Jaffa, Palestinians in the north and the Galilee, Palestinians in the south. This is the theme that reemerges over and over again in Israeli history. So in 2000, you have, after the failure at Camp David, you have senior Israeli military official Giora Eiland, whose name you've probably heard a lot in the past year and a half, because he's also been one of the pioneers of the quote-unquote generals plan that Israel adopted in September 2024 to ethnically cleanse the north of the Gaza Strip. What led many genocide scholars like Omar Bartov to shift their position from this being a campaign of mass murder in Gaza to this being a campaign of genocide in Gaza. But now we're getting off track. So this same Israeli military official, Giora Eiland, in already going back to 2000, he proposed Gaza's expansion into North Sinai, where the Palestinians could establish some type of entity, some type of, of course, demilitarized, subject to Israeli military control. Israel would give a piece of land, a piece of this desert wasteland to Egypt. Sorry, Israel would give a piece of its desert wasteland somewhere along the Egypt-Israel border to Egypt in exchange for this sort of Palestinian demilitarized entity subject to Israeli domination. Of course, Egyptian president at the time, Hosni Mubarak, rejected the idea outright, just as his predecessor, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has rejected the plan outright to do the same thing in the past year and a half. In 2019, Israeli authorities there was actually a plan that emerged within Israel to allow Gaza Strip residents who wanted to immigrate to fly out via Israel if a country could be found to accept them. This was a plan that was put forward by a senior government official in Israel. On October 24th, 2023, as we all probably recall, Israel's plans to expel the Gaza's Palestinians to Sinai were leaked. There was a think tank associated with the Israeli Defense Ministry that published a 25-page PDF detailing Israel's plans to forcibly remove all 2.2 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to some quote unquote sterile zone in the Gaza Strip, or excuse me, in Sinai, that would be a site, would be perhaps one of the largest refugee camps in the world, meant for a surplus of humans, that is to say the civilian population of Gaza. Let's talk a bit about the rise of Netanyahu over the past 14 years. He was elected prime minister in 2009 and has ruled Israel since, save for a brief period in 2022. He has been prime minister ever since. His main objective, if you had to really summarize Netanyahu's rule over the past 14 years, it's to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state. And to this end, he has supported Hamas's rule in Gaza. He's allowed Qatari officials to fly into Ben Gurion Airport to transport suitcases full of cash every month over the course of the past, 10 years or so. Every month, Qatari officials, they take a car, they drive that car through the Eretz military checkpoint with suitcases full of cash, with the full knowledge and support of the Israeli military and of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Hamas. And so perhaps it's fair to say that Netanyahu, who has provided material support to Hamas, could perhaps be labeled pro-Hamas. If you want to throw around the label pro-Hamas, Netanyahu might be a good person to use it with. But in any case, the goal here was not, he did not allow Qatar to transfer cash to Hamas because he had any kind of liking for the organization. No, he believed that the best way to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state was by ensuring Fatah and Hamas remain divided. Because if the Palestinians are divided rather than united, then it's impossible for them to form a unity government. It's impossible for them to actually for them to negotiate, right? Because how do you negotiate when your national movement is totally divided? It's very, very hard to establish a position that you can build buy-in for with all Palestinians. And so that was his goal, because so long as Hamas is in power in Gaza, Israel also has the ability to say, how can we negotiate with terrorists, right? We can't do that. So therefore, we can just pursue indefinite occupation, pursue indefinite apartheid, pursue the indefinite siege and blockade on Gaza. And that was effectively the plan, at least on the eve of October 7th. That was the plan. Of course, Netanyahu has he has four outstanding trials. We have to keep updating these slides as he gets charged with more crimes. But he has outstanding trials for bribery, corruption, and breach of public trust. And many argue that this is one of the main reasons why Netanyahu has decided to prolong this war as long as he can, because he knows that once the war ends, there may well be an election in Israel where he's voted out of power. Once he's no longer prime minister, he has to sit again on trial, and he may wind up in prison. And as you perhaps know, there was a documentary just released where you can actually see the interrogations that were conducted by the Shin Bet, the Israeli security services, with Netanyahu during these trials, and he's interrogated, and the interrogations are just absolutely remarkable. I highly recommend everyone watch that documentary, which is actually banned in Israel. Shocker. The rise of religious Zionism. So you could say that after the 1967 war, you really start to see the growth and the strengthening of the religious right in Israel, known as the National Religious Bloc, the Religious Zionist Bloc. In the United States, you might call it modern Orthodox, serves as a functional equivalent. But basically, it's a movement of Jews who say 1967 was not just a military victory, but it was a miraculous victory. It was a divine victory, destined by God to return the holy sites to rule by Jews. And you could really say that it transformed Israeli society, because as you can see here, pictured to the right, this movement of far-right religious Zionist, has now taken over, is now in political power. They sit in the current Israeli government. Bezalel Smotrich, pictured here to the right, who is the leader of the religious Zionist party. He is still in the Israeli cabinet, although not the security cabinet. Itamar Ben-Gvir recently left the coalition after Netanyahu signed the ceasefire deal back in January. He left the coalition, but of course is still an important power player in Israeli politics. Most of the violent settler militias carrying out pogroms that you see every day in the West Bank, they are carried out by members of these political parties and their militant militias, and the militias that are offsprings of these groups, like the Tag Mechir group, the price tag group that carries out these very deadly pogroms on a regular cadence now in the West Bank. Here, just to get into a bit more detail, the settler violence that is an outgrowth of this religious right movement in Israel has increased in recent years. There were something like 900 attacks in 2021, and then 22 was more violent than 2021, and then 2023 on the eve of October 7th was even more violent than 2022. And then, of course, the past 16 and a half months has been even more violent than 2023. And so you could really say that Palestinians are facing an unprecedented level of violence. In 2023, there were multiple pogroms committed. What do we mean when we say pogrom? We mean dozens, if not hundreds, of Israeli settlers entering Palestinian towns and villages, lighting homes on fire, beating people to death, destroying property, slashing tires, destroying water tanks, destroying solar panels, and committing murder. And in many cases, Palestinians are injured or killed by these Israeli settlers and their supporters. And of course, they face total impunity. More than 90% of them have never been charged with anything. The violence that often occurs in front of Israeli soldiers or Israeli military police, who rarely, if ever, interfere. And when they do interfere, they oftentimes interfere on behalf of the Israeli settlers carrying out the violence. And over the past decade or so, what we've seen is Israeli society turn to the right. I don't have it pictured here, but actually going a little bit further back, you began to see these polls coming out of Israeli society from 2006, 7, and 8 onwards. 50% of Israeli Jews refuse to live in an apartment building with Arabs, for example. 60% of Israeli youth refuse to sit in a classroom with an Arab. This has been the polling pretty consistently coming out of Israel for the past 20 years now. And of course, it's reflected in the statements of Israeli ministers sitting in government as well. Minister of Welfare Chaim Katz, quote, "The land of Israel is whole. There is no Palestine." Deputy Foreign Minister Tzipi Hatoveli, "This land is ours. All of it is ours." In 2016, Uri Ariel, Minister of Agriculture, "Between the river and the sea will only be the Jewish state. There are not two states west of the Jordan, and the Temple Mount is ours." 2021, Naftali Bennett, then Prime Minister of Israel, quote, "There is no room for another state between the sea and the Jordan because of our right to the land." 2023, Minister of Justice, Yariv Lavin, "The entire land of Israel will be ours, as it should be." Netanyahu, of course, is of a similar view. All the land from the river to the sea will be Jewish, will be in control of the Jewish people. As he put it, quote, "The Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop the settlements of all parts of the land of Israel in the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, and Judea and Samaria," end quote. That's from December 2022. Netanyahu says in January 2024, quote, "I will not compromise on full Israeli security control over all the territory west of Jordan." And this is contrary to a Palestinian state. That was an ex post in 2024. I want to talk just a bit about some of the laws passed in the state of Israel in the past decade and a half or so. You have the Nakba law in 2011, in which the state will withhold funds from any government-funded institution or body that commemorates Israel's Independence Day as a day of mourning. In other words, if you believe that the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 is worth commemorating, you will not be able to receive any funding from the state of Israel. And in 2019, Tel Aviv University was forced to cancel a lecture by the politician Ofer Kasif, the only Israeli non-Zionist Jew in the Israeli parliament. citing this law as the reason. Then you have the nation state law of 2018. This law defines Israel as, quote, the nation state of the Jewish people, and adds that, quote, fulfilling the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. This law, this nation state law, it became a basic law. That is to say, it has a quasi-constitutional like status, capable of overriding any ordinary legislation. It constitutionally, thus it constitutionally enshrines Jewish supremacy over non-Jewish citizens of the state of Israel. The law contains no commitment to democratic norms or guarantee of the right to equality or prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race, nationality, or ethnicity. And thus, Israel's Druze community, historically, some of the most loyal community of any community in the state of Israel, came out and protested en masse, because here you have Israel explicitly excluding Druze from the nation, from the group of people who the state is supposed to serve. The interests of the state are aligned with Jews, no one else. They're supposed to ensure that the state of Israel fulfills the self-determination and the national rights and goals of the Jewish people, thus, of course, excluding all the other non-Jews living within the borders of the state of Israel as part of the community and the interests of the groups that the Israeli state is supposed to support. You have, of course, the judicial reform. This was the major issue in Israeli society leading up to October 7th. For about 15 months, every single Saturday night, you had hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews descending to the streets to protest what was at the time known as the quote-unquote judicial reform agenda. What did the judicial reform agenda entail? It entailed eroding judicial review, effectively weakening the oversight powers of Israel's Supreme Court. It included giving the Israeli government absolute power over the appointment of judges and prosecutors. It enabled a simple majority. So this is the key point right here. It enabled a simple majority in the Israeli parliament to override a ruling of the Supreme Court. And it prevented the High Court from reviewing or challenging any of Israel's basic laws. In other words, Israel is effectively only really has two branches of government. You have the parliament, who's and the leader of the coalition is the prime minister. So that's one branch of government. And then you have the judiciary, which is the other branch of government. And so effectively, the reason why so many Israeli Jews were so bothered by this, as you can see here, this was primarily an issue internal to Israeli Jewish society. As you can see here, there are no Palestinian flags in this protest from June 2023. They're all Israeli flags. And that's because this wasn't an issue internal to Jewish Israeli society, having very little to do with the Palestinians. It was the Israeli left upset that the Israeli Jewish left was upset that the Israeli Jewish right was effectively deleting the judiciary, was effectively giving the Israeli parliament the ability to overrule any Supreme Court decision with a simple majority of the Israeli parliament, thus effectively rendering the judiciary weak and powerless in the face of any decision made by the Israeli parliament, turning Israel from call it two branches of government really to effectively only having one branch of government, where the Israeli prime minister and his or her ruling coalition make all the decisions. And that was the goal of this judicial reform agenda. And that's why it caused so much outrage in Israeli Jewish society. But it's important to remember that one of the key motivations for this judicial reform agenda came from these far-right ministers like Smotrich, like Ben-Gvir. And what were they concerned with? They wanted to prevent the court from blocking things like punishing Palestinians, from things like expanding settlements, confiscating land, and ultimately annexing the West Bank. And that was their ultimate desire, and why they were so hell-bent on trying to cancel the judiciary. Having said all that, Israel's judiciary has never really been a friend of the Palestinians. The courts have long approved the demolition of thousands of Palestinian homes. They approved the destruction of Khirbet Susia in the occupied West Bank in 2018. They approved the demolition of 9 villages in Mustafa Yatta in 2022. Recall, this was a decision that the Israeli Supreme Court made, allowing the Israeli military to forcibly expel some 1,150 Palestinian residents living in the southern Hebron Hills in the occupied West Bank. The court has upheld many administrative detention orders over the years in which Palestinians are detained indefinitely without charge for having committed a crime in the future. The court also upheld a law which imposes arbitrary, racially motivated restrictions on Palestinian family reunification. Now, we have a few slides left, and in the last few minutes here, I want to talk a bit about Zionism outside of the state of Israel. As we said in the first slide, Israel really replaced the Zionist movement, right? As we said, the institutions of the government of Israel replaced all of these Zionist institutions, which had previously been global. But of course, Zionism continued to exist outside of Israel. And perhaps one of the most important movements of Zionists today is Christian Zionism in the United States. Well, let's say it's primarily based in the United States, but of course, you have Christian Zionists all around the world. And you could say that these Christian Zionists believe the modern state of Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. They point to chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15, various passages in Deuteronomy where they say, look, there it is. God promised Abraham the land of Palestine, and God promised Abraham's offspring the land of Palestine. Thus, the modern Jewish people have a right to establish Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. That is the basic argument that is made by Christian Zionists today. They also would say that Jews are, quote unquote, the chosen people, and thus God set up the Jews as a nation favored above others. You'll hear that argument as well. Evangelical Zionists believe, as we said, that God promised the land of Israel to the Jews, and thus it is incumbent upon Christians to support Israel. The leader of this Christian Zionist movement is, I would say it's John Hagee. He is the founder of the largest Zionist organization in the United States, known as Christians United for Israel, with some 10 million members strong. That's just registered members. There are many tens of millions more Christian Zionists in the United States. And thus you could say the overwhelming majority, I don't know if it's 95% or 98%, but the overwhelming majority of Zionists in the United States are not Jewish, they're Christian. And thus, if you hear someone say, being anti-Zionist is being anti-Semitic, well, or that being Zionist, is necessary. If you're Jewish, you have to be Zionist. Well, that's obviously nonsense, because actually the vast majority of Zionists are not Jews. So that is one other very important point to make here. And as John Hagee, the other important point I want to make on this slide is that many of these Christian Zionists have a long history of stoking anti-Semitism. For example, John Hagee's book, Jerusalem Countdown, he claims Adolf Hitler, was, quote, a half-breed Jew sent by God as, quote, a hunter to persecute Europe's Jews and drive them towards, quote, the only home God ever intended for the Jews to have, Israel. To rephrase, the most important Zionist in the United States published a book in which he said God sent Hitler to planet Earth to murder 6 million Jews in Europe so that they would get pushed to Israel. So the leader of the Zionist movement, of the largest movement of Zionists in the United States, is a raging anti-Semite and believes Hitler was sent to planet Earth by God to mass murder the Jews. And as a Jew, I find it incredibly painful to see so many people conflate Judaism and anti-Semitism when, as you can see here, there's actually a tendency among anti-Semites to embrace Zionism. Hagee blamed anti-Semitism on Jews themselves, writing, quote, it was the disobedience and rebellion of the Jews that gave rise to the opposition and persecution that they experienced, beginning in Canaan, continuing to this very day. Zionism in the United States had you could say, kind of a period of flourishing and burgeoning throughout the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. Support for Israel dominated American Jewish life. It was part and parcel of the American Jewish consensus on what it means to be a Jew. And it's voiced by a large majority of American Jews. I would say, we're going to get to this on the next slide, that percentage is definitely decreasing quite rapidly, actually. But during the 90s, it was basically unchallenged. During the Clinton period, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden period, AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobbying groups exerted enormous influence over the office of the president and the U.S. Congress. Palestinians were nearly completely absent from public discourse. And you have here a study by the professor at Arizona University, Maha Nasser, who examined some 3,000 articles, or more than 3,000 articles published about Palestinians in the Washington Post and the New York Times and a half dozen other some important publications in the United States. And what did she find? Less than 1% of articles written about Palestinians were written by Palestinians. In other words, they're completely absent from the conversation for many decades in places like the United States. over the past decade and a half or two, what we've been witnessing is what Peter Beinart calls the crisis in Zionism among young American Jews. He published an essay titled The Crisis of Zionism in 2012, already more than 13 years ago, writing that the Jewish establishment asked American Jews to check their liberalism at the door, only to find that many young American Jews had instead checked their Zionism instead. And he's recently published a book that just came out called Judaism After the Destruction of Gaza. And in this book, he argues that the American Jewish establishment, the religion of the American Jewish establishment is Zionism. It's not Judaism, it's Zionism. There's a film about this, it's called Israelism. In other words, if you declare yourself an atheist, you can be the president of any American Jewish organization. You can eat a bacon and cheeseburger on Yom Kippur, and you could be an outstanding member of the American Jewish establishment. But if you declare Israel should be a state for all its citizens rather than a state for the Jewish people, you will be excommunicated. And thus, American Jewish institutions are not Jewish, they are Zionist. They have abandoned Judaism. Judaism says idolatry is totally forbidden. You cannot worship idols. And he would argue that actually Israel is an idol, that the American Jewish establishment has placed Israel above all else. And thus the American Jewish establishment has abandoned Judaism in favor of Zionism. Thus it has replaced Judaism with idolatry. And that's why, by the way, JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, has been growing. It's, I think, probably the fastest growing Jewish organization in the United States. I would also argue that it's the largest anti-Zionist organization in the United States. Let me repeat that. The largest group, political group of anti-Zionists in the United States, it's not Arab, it's not Muslim, it's not Palestinian, it's Jewish. Okay? Yeah, they have some 40 full-time employees. Okay? We're talking about a large organization with many, many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of members. We're talking about American Jews who reject Zionism, who believe all people are equal, and who believe Israel should be a state for its citizens and not for Jews. And thus, 40% of young American Jews described Israel as an apartheid state in 2022. We're talking about a majority today. 2 years later, that percentage must be dramatically higher. We're talking about today, a majority of young American Jews call Israel an apartheid state. 1/3 of American Jews, according to polling from a few months ago, agreed Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza. That's 1/3 of all American Jews of all ages called Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide. Over 51% of American Jews supported Biden's decision to withhold arms shipments to Israel. J Street is an organization that was founded, let's say, as a liberal Zionist organization, describing itself as pro-Israel and pro-peace. The two-state solution, founded by Jeremy Ben-Ami, a former Clinton advisor, they're pro-two-state solution, but they oppose recognizing Palestine as a state at the UN in 2011. Not sure how you square that circle. In October 2023, J Street also pushed for a congressional resolution that pledged unconditional support for Israel's war in Gaza, threatening to withhold endorsement from Democrats who refused to sign onto J Street's support for unconditional arms transfers to Israel over the past 17 months. So that's the liberal Zionism in the United States, supporting unconditional arms transfers to a country that is, according to Human Rights Watch, according to Amnesty, according to Doctors Without Borders, and now according to a UN report that was published yesterday, carrying out a genocide in Gaza. The Zionist lobby in the United States is quite strong. You could say its impact on the media has been profound. According to an Intercept study conducted that was reviewing media articles on Gaza over the first 6 weeks of the war. So at a time when Israel had killed roughly 15,000 Palestinians already, this study found that the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, quote, disproportionately emphasized Israeli deaths in the conflict, even though Israel had killed 15 times more Palestinians than Palestinians had killed Israelis. That these media organizations, quote, used emotive language to describe the killing of Israelis, but not Palestinians, and offered lopsided coverage of anti-Semitic acts while ignoring anti-Muslim racism. The only Palestinian member of the U.S. Congress, Rashida Tlaib, was censored by her peers in a 234 to 188 vote over her comments on Israel's war. She called for a ceasefire, and thus she was censured by her peers. And AIPAC, AIPAC has a long history of spending millions of dollars to defeat anyone in the U.S. Congress who speaks out against Israeli occupation and Israeli apartheid, such as, for example, the campaign to help Glenn Ivey defeat Donna Edwards in 2022. Also in 2022, Haley Stevens unseated Andy Levin, who was, by the way, the strongest Jewish voice in Congress, standing for the political and human rights of the Palestinian people. They got rid of him as well. In 2022, AIPAC gave $3 million to Steve Irwin, even though he lost. In 2022, they also spent millions on Chantel Brown, who defeated Nina Turner, who was also an outspoken advocate for Palestinian human rights. And just to round things out, of course, in the past election campaign, AIPAC spent a whopping $100 million to elect pro-apartheid and pro-genocide candidates to the U.S. Congress, including offering $20 million to both Hill Harper and Nasser Beydoun, Michigan-based Democrats, to try to unseat Rashida Tlaib. Both of them rejected the blood money. However, AIPAC did manage to spend $15 million to defeat Jamal Bowman. They spent another $8 million to defeat Cori Bush. Again, anyone expressing any kind of sympathy for the Palestinians supporting a ceasefire, they were the target of AIPAC. And with that, we're going to wrap the presentation and turn to Q&A. Thank you so much for attending and for hanging around. Look, I think we're seeing it's a very scary time in the United States right now. We had a permanent resident, a green card holder, Mahmoud Khalil, a friend of mine, who was abducted for political speech. And it's an incredibly scary time to be living in this country right now, where you can be just pulled out of your home, abducted by ICE agents, imprisoned, disappeared, and deported for having committed the crime of expressing your political opinion. And so I think it's important for all of us as we're now experiencing a new era in American political life, that we continue to be loud and to be vocal and to stand up for those who are speaking out, people like Mahmoud Khalil and others, because there is strength in numbers. And if we stand up and if we protest and if we resist, then we have a chance. So I would just encourage everyone to keep fighting, keep struggling, in support of all human life and in support of the Palestinian people.
Thank you. And also to note that this is a Palestinian green card holder who was abducted in the United States by a government official for his dissident speech, which is precisely what happens in textbook dictatorships. So this is how subordinated and repressed and oppressed being Palestinian in the United States is. And so in some ways, perhaps the US is starting to become more like Israel in that regard. And so I think we should keep an eye out on the type of policies and practices and laws and policies that many of the pro-Israeli Zionist groups want and are trying to enforce at universities and in various aspects of American society, is to try to Israelize the United States. And that would be quite un-American, I will posit. But with that, thank you so much, Dr. Foster, for your presentation. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you to everyone who attended. And again, we don't expect you to agree with us. We just offer different perspectives at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights that intentionally provides the experiences and perspectives of Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians on the various policy and legal issues that impact these diverse communities. And so I will encourage everyone who wants to learn more about the center to go to csrr.rutgers.edu. If you want us to keep doing this programming, press the donate button. Please give generously and share with your networks. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Race and Rights podcast, which I host. And hopefully we'll see you at our next event. And with that, ma salama, and thank you very much.